Welcome, Linda Lord here. Today we are going to be doing a segment on storytelling. This is one of 3 sections that we're going to be spending. Now, again, because we're talking about music, you may want to put on a favorite piece of music that you find inspiring or one that ignites your creativity. We're going to start with the basic elements of a good story. Now, you probably all have a favorite book that you've read, or hearkening back to your childhood, maybe a favorite fairy tale or bedtime story that you enjoyed listening to. As you think about those, there's probably a couple of things that come to your mind. One is the character and the characterization, and second, the plot. So I want to spend just a little bit of time in this segment talking about your character, your characterization, and what you have them doing. So whenever I start working on a writing project, I usually start with a theme or a topic. So what do I want to talk about? And then I focus on who is the best person or people to tell that story. Sometimes it's a child's perspective. Sometimes it's an adult. Sometimes I start thinking it's going to be just 1 or 2 people. And as the story starts to expand and starts to come to life, I realize and recognize that more characters are required. Then I have a very thick binder that contains several questions that I ask regarding my characters, starting with very basic information: gender identity, hair color, eye color, basic facial structure, basic body type. Are they athletic? Are they husky? Are they emaciated? I then will look at culture and identity and who is best able to tell this story, being appreciative of culture, but not appropriating culture. So I'm always very sensitive to the stories that I tell so that there is authenticity in the voices of my character, but also in their experiences, and that I'm not taking myself into a place where I don't necessarily have authority to be. Now, in some cases, I am asked to write pieces where I need to have the voice of someone who I don't personally represent culturally. In that case, I will interview and talk with individuals who can speak authentically and truthfully to that perspective. That's just a bit of a side note for you. Then I move on to the next layer or the next level of questions that are relevant for my characterization. It might be favorite food. It might be least favorite food. It might be favorite color, time of day. Why do they like that time of day? Where do they live and who do they live with? If they're a child, they may live with their parents. If they're a child, they may no longer live with their parents. And why is that? There might be siblings involved. Does my character have a best friend? Many friends? The depth of the relationships. If it's an older character, I may look at friendship betrayal, relationship breakdown. How many times has my character found themselves in this particular situation with some variation? May want to look at their age, may want to look at their medical history. I then might go into them some very specific things. Do they keep their room messy or neat? Do they eat all of their food on their plate in little separate piles, or do they kind of mush it so that no matter what they're eating, it all kind of looks like stew? Maybe they have a favorite piece of music. Maybe they're artistically inclined. Maybe they're athletic. Maybe they have a very scientific and mathematical mind. You can ask any question about your character that you believe is relevant to how they're going to tell their story. I was working with a group of students not too long ago on this exercise, and one of the children identified that their character was going to have a gluten allergy. They couldn't eat anything that had gluten in it. That's a very important piece of information for us to know about our character. In some cases, that piece of information might never be relevant to the story that we're telling. But in this particular situation, the student and I did a role play. We did some improv together. And I was his waitress at a restaurant. And he came in to order lunch and ordered a sandwich, but needed gluten-free bread. And I didn't have any that day. And so we got into this conversation about how this restaurant wasn't really catering to the needs of the community that they said they served. Really important information that student was able to identify doing her character backstory around this gluten sensitivity or this gluten allergy. So as you work through the series of questions, the fact that your character has to eat only gluten-free food might never come up in conversation, but absolutely comes up when the character is making a behavioral choice or is taking action in the storyline. You can tell that I feel very strongly about character and characterization. And people actually recommend specific books for me to read that are very strong on the character development, which I really appreciate as well. So then you come to this point where your character may have a figure of speech, or they may have certain phrases or words that they use repetitively, and that means something to them. So we're not giving these characters attributes as throwaways. They really are intentional to help us to tell the story that we most want to tell. Then you start working on the plot, which is the beginning, the middle, and the end of your story. Pretty simple elementary school structure for story. We can elaborate on that and will in other segments. But for this one, where does this story start? What's the rising action? What is that moment, that crisis moment, or that change moment where your character will make a decision that changes their future? And then how do you resolve that? Now, it doesn't have to always be a long story. We can choose our genre. It might be a short story. It might be postcard fiction. If you really want to hone your storytelling skills, try and do it as a tweet, where you only have a certain number of characters, not words, but characters, and you have to be able to tell a complete story in 120 characters. So that gives you a little bit of an introduction to character work. How do we create these characters that we're going to use in our storytelling? And also a basic plot structure, which is where do we come in, what happens, and how do we resolve it? And that conflict, that middle point reaching that crisis, can be an internal conflict. It can be an external conflict with other people or with nature. But it's going to be, if it's going to be an interesting story, there really needs to be that moment when your character, based on all of the backstory work you've done, has to make a decision, has to choose, has to take action. Otherwise, you're going to lose your audience. It's just not that interesting to them. So I'm going to leave you there for today, and I'm going to invite you to go away, think about a story that you would like to tell, and who is it that is going to be the best person to tell it, and then do your backstory.